这边提示一下，我虽然买了 CD Pass， 但是有一些景点 CD Pass 是需要做 reservation 的，所以记得要 check 一下。那我现在要去的是坐船，它会有一个短路途的绕 Chicago City 的一个小的 tour。那可以看一下Chicago 的风景。那我选的是晚上，这边是有一个 trick， 是因为我停在Aon parking lot 里面。Aon Building 是 Aon Building， 它应该是一个商业大楼，但是它上面是办公的。那它地下室的停车有一些很特别的 program， 我觉得还蛮棒的。比方说，如果它有 early day program， 就是我昨天停的，那早上应该是9点以前进去，然后在下午5点之前你需要离开，这样17块。那有一个晚上的 program 是16块，是你要在7点以后才能够进去，然后可以到第二天早上的5点，对不起，第二天早上的应该是8点吧，7、8点离开。那这样子价格是16块，所以相对来说非常的划算。那所以我今天的计划就是把车停在这个停车场里面过夜，最大的包里面把相对比较重要的东西放在车子的 saddle bag 可以锁的，那其他的我觉得那个大包就放在车子的后面，然后用许多的绳子把它绑起来。那如果真的不小心有人去偷它，那没办法，但起码掉的东西相对就是一些衣物没那么重要，起码不会很严重的影响这一次的行程。OK， 那基本上是这样子。
My name is Ricky. I'm going to be your docent, your guide, your teacher here as we journey through the Chicago River together. So you're going to see some beautiful, beautiful sights here tonight. So you're going to see some really spectacular buildings, hear all about their history and architecture, how they came to be made. However, you are also going to hear a little bit about the story of Chicago today. Now I want you to walk away knowing this, that the story of Chicago is a story of resiliency. It's a story of strength, tenacity, grit, in the face of problems or challenges. It's a nearly 2-century-long journey of self-improvement, of a city trying to make itself better, trying to make itself more beautiful for its citizens and visitors. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the tool of the architecture of the city to talk about this resiliency. But we're also going to have exactly one boatload of fun here today. So whether you are from Chicago, from across the country, or across the world, you're now all on vacation, so please sit back. Relax. Grab a drink from our amazing bartender Jamie at the bottom of the boat and enjoy your time here at the shoreline sightseeing. So, first up on our architectural journey is over here on our right with this beautiful lit up clock tower. This is the Wrigley Building. The Wrigley Building with that clock tower was built in the early 1920s, now over 100 years ago. This is a style of architecture, one of the many, many, many different styles that we'll encounter today along the river. This is called Spanish Revival style, Spanish Revival. We call it that because that clock tower up there was modeled after La Giralda, a cathedral in Sevilla, Spain. The top part of this clock tower is similar to the top part of this old cathedral you can see in southern Spain. They are looking at over 250,000 glazed terracotta tiles of cream and white in 6 different shades. Terracotta is a material softer than porcelain that must be hand washed with soap and water every year. Now, looking at the beautiful Wrigley building, good example of what we were doing with architecture in the US in the early 1920s, which was often copying all these European styles of architecture. In the early 1920s, the US didn't really have its own identity in architecture yet, so we were often borrowing from these European designs. Wouldn't be until later on, in the 1920s, a couple of years later, that we get a style uniquely our own, kind of uniquely American. And we'll talk about that style once we see it from the river. But in the meantime, we're going to jump ahead over 80 years forward in time to Trump International Hotel and Tower. This is the second tallest tower in Chicago at 1,389 feet. And this is a style of architecture called contextualism. So we see these 3 patios in the building. These patios all correspond to heights of neighboring buildings. So the first patio corresponds to the roof of the Wrigley building that we just spoke about. That second patio corresponds to the height of that dome building across the river, the Jewelers building with that big dome that we'll discuss later. And then the third patio, way up there, corresponds to the height of this black box building. You can start to see right behind the Trump Tower, black building called the AMA Plaza. But that's the idea of contextualism, this site-specific design, custom-made for its environment, all about blending in with your surroundings, harmonizing with other buildings surrounding it. Now, finished in 2009, it was designed by Adrian Smith. Adrian Smith, he is an architect from Chicago, and he has designed the tallest towers in the whole wide world. And you'll hear more about this guy from Chicago, Adrian Smith, a little later. But now on our right is a true local favorite, and definitely a me favorite, these 2 iconic circular towers on the right, Marina City. Now you may recognize Marina City from any number of TV shows, films, commercials over the years, from Steve McQueen's final film called The Hunter in 1880. They drove a car up the side of the building into the river, to the recent remake of Candyman, where there was a lovely murder filmed on a balcony over here. So lots of cool stuff has been shot there. And here at Shoreline Sightseeing, most of us just refer to these buildings as the Corncob Towers. Who knows why? Big mystery. But in the 1960s, when these were built, no one was really living in downtown Chicago back then. It was industrial down here, a lot of office buildings. And there was an architect from Chicago, Bertrand Goldberg, who really wanted to attract people to live downtown. So he built this utopian, vertically stacked world. He built a city within a city, because in Marina City, when those were built, you could have everything you need, live above the river. In these buildings, you could find restaurants, shops, a swimming pool, a skating rink, a bowling alley, a movie theater, and of course, at the bottom, plenty of parking. A key essential to living in downtown Chicago. Listen, if you own a car down here, parking, very precious. Now, I know the idea of having amenities in your building, maybe not the newest thing in 2024, but in the 60s when they built them, the idea of having all these things in your apartment building, not really having to leave your complex for much of anything, really new concept. So Bertrand Goldberg was really pioneering a new form of apartment living. More from him later. But jumping across the river with me to this tall glass building with crisscross panels of illuminated granite, 77 West Wacker, most beautifully lit building on the river in my opinion. At the top, you'll see this lit up sort of temple, Greek temple up there. So this is a style of architecture called neoclassical. You take this classical design, so a bit like the Parthenon up there, and you just sort of update it. You use all these modern materials, glass, steel, granite, put your own little personal stamp on it. That building designed by Ricardo Bofill, one of the few international architects on our river from Barcelona. Now I do want to point out the lovely Riverwalk area where tons of people are down here. The Riverwalk is a relatively new public amenity, finished in 2016, that zippers together 1.3 miles of Chicago River shoreline. Perfect example of a little Chicago-style resiliency, because 20 years ago, before they started building this river walk, people could not come down to the river. The river was not really accessible at all. So the city had invested in the future, in beauty, and now you can enjoy the river like never before. Go for a walk or a jog, grab a drink. Such a big focal point of the downtown experience is this riverfront now, which is kind of a change for the city from decades back. Now, speaking of this river, Chicago is here today. All of us are here today because of this body of water. The Chicago River is the waterway that connects Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River. That is why Chicago is built where it is, because this river, it meets our lake about a mile east and then continues west via canals, other rivers, hundreds of miles, eventually on the other side of Illinois, reaching the Mississippi River. So we were just a huge port here in the U.S., especially in the 1800s, and we have been a center of trade and commerce and transportation ever since that time period. And you really can trace everything back in a way just to this river. Now, people often ask me about what we do to the river in March, and that is that we dye it green. Yes, in case you've never heard of this before, ever since 1962, the Chicago Plumbers Union has been dyeing our river bright shamrock, Kelly green every March for St. Patrick's Day. This is a huge Chicago tradition. There is a big parade downtown, and before the parade, the plumbers get on some of our boats. They go up and down the river and dye the river green using these big hoses of vegetable dye, and it turns it neon green for about 10 days. It's a really big tradition here. People are having hundreds of thousands of people down here, and they're having a lot of fun, to put it one way. But it's a really cool day for the city of Chicago. So if you've never experienced this before, or you're curious, come back in March, sail down the Green River, go to the parade, but do bring your coats, or 3 for March in Chicago. But let's return to the 1920s. On the right, in this huge building, the Merchandise Mart. Oh, okay, so this is actually a really cool thing. This is a digital art show that happens on the Merchandise Mart every single evening for most of the year. This is called Art on the Mart. Art on the Mart, you can see that projector system on the left. That's projecting all that art onto this building. This happens every evening from 9 to 9:30, basically. And they do different stuff throughout the year. It's not always what you're looking at right now. Usually it's some different stuff, different art being projected, etc. This is sort of the 4th of July special that they've had here, running here for about a month. So it's a very cool thing. I'll talk about the building a little bit later once we see it. I know this is very cool stuff happening on it. Again, Art on the Mart. If you want to see the whole show, you can do what these folks are doing. Just come down to the Riverwalk here tomorrow, the next night, or the next night, or the night after that, 9 to 9:30 p.m. But now, we are about to enter one of my favorite spots on this entire river. This is called Wolf Point. Wolf Point we are entering now. Hey, we're having fun too. Architecture. All right, straight ahead of Wolf Point, where you'll see almost 360 degrees of modern glass skyscraper. On our left is the Nuveen building, this curvy green building here. The Nuveen building is another example of contextualism, because the curve in this building is mimicking the curve here in the river. There's blue glass that will match the blue of the sky, and there's also green glass that will match the green of the river. So that's contextualism as well. You're trying to blend in with the natural context, which in this case is a beautiful green curving river. Now straight ahead of us, giant glass building. Which one? So this one, in front of us, it's got a big spirally sculpture in front of it. This is called River Point from 2017. River Point, just 2017. Now with the arches up there at the top and at the bottom, I do also call that one the Hot Pocket. Now, it's about 7 years old. It is very new. Many of the buildings surrounding us right now, incredibly new, with one really big exception. As we turn here, in front of us on the right, you're going to see this red building, Fulton House. Fulton House, that red building, is the oldest building on this river. It is from 1898. Now, before they turned it into these beautiful condos in the late 1970s, back in 1898, it was a cold storage freezing building. It was like a big refrigerator with barely any windows for the meatpacking industry. Meatpacking was our big industry in the early 1900s in Chicago. The export here was meat. Chicago was called the hog butcher to the world. Wow, great nickname. The city of big shoulders, even better nickname, after our really strong meatpacking workers. They would bring all this meat from the south side of the city, freeze it in Fulton House right there, and then ship the meat across the country on trains, like the ones that used to run on that upraised bridge. Speaking of this bridge, this is the Carroll Avenue Railroad Bridge. This is a 1908 historic landmark that is now permanently raised in this upright position, but it demonstrates exactly how Chicago-style bridges work. So you see that big piece of concrete to the right of the bridge? That concrete block sort of swings down, letting the top part of that bridge to lower. You raise it back up to where it is now, it'll counterweight the bridge into the air. So it works just like a little seesaw. It's called a trunnion bascule bridge or a Chicago-style bridge. They nearly all work in this way. Now, if this bridge were to lower, you would reach the river cottages on the left. Now, these very unique cottages, you'll see have that triangular design. Porthole windows. That might remind you of a sailboat. That's because the architect was Harry Weiss, and he was a big sailor. He really loved sailing, this architect, so he put these nautical, triangular sailboat shapes into lots of his buildings here in Chicago. Now, when Weiss built those cottages in the late 1980s, people thought he was a little crazy, but not really for the design. See, back in the 80s, people did not really want to live on the north branch of the river we are on now. The north branch used to be this smelly, gross, industrial part of the river. People didn't really want to be down here. Now you can see that kind of, that old attitude for the river here on the right in the East Bank Club. The East Bank Club is a pretty swanky fitness club and a nice gym. People like Barack Obama, Oprah Winfrey have all exercised right there. But you'll notice it looks like you're looking at the back of a building. Because you are. It's almost like it's treating the river as its alleyway. It's kind of turning its back on the river. They did not even have windows when it was built in the early 80s. But that was the old attitude. No one wanted to look at the river, let alone live on it. But as you can now see on the left, beautiful condos, beautiful townhouses. There are a lot of people who want to live on the river. So our river here has become a much more beautiful place over the last few decades, and the health of our river continues to improve, and so does our relationship with the river continue to evolve. And we'll talk more about that as we keep going. But we're now going to turn around, we're going to do this little U-turn, and we're going to go to what's called the south branch of the river, where there's way more cool stuff to see. Give you a chance to visit our amazing bartender, Jamie, downstairs, grab something to drink perhaps. This is, by the way, this is our last ride of the evening. That means that Jamie will shut down the bar before we get back, so I would say visit him early, visit him often. And any questions, please just raise your hand, say, hey, Ricky, I'll come right over to you. Otherwise, I'll see you in about 2 to 3 minutes. Welcome back to Wolf Point. Wolf Point, once more, this area that we are entering Just to orient ourselves again, we're going west down the main branch of the river. We just turn north onto the north branch. Now we're going to go south down the south branch. Then we come back up and we go east and end where we start. But Wolf Point is fascinating to me because of just how new everything is in this area. Most of these buildings, again, surrounding us right now are under 10 years old. Brand new, brand new, brand new, brand new. And this one straight ahead, brand new. This tall glass office building with this really narrow Y-shaped base, sort of looking like a big pencil stuck into the ground. That is 150 North Riverside, 150 North Riverside from 2017. Now it has this unique base shape for two important reasons. So number one, it's so that the building's caissons, basically the foundations of the building, that they're not interfering with the Metro and Amtrak trains running right underneath the ground, right by the side of the building. And then number two, the city does have a rule nowadays for 30 feet to be left for a riverwalk area. For all these new buildings getting built on the river, they'll need space for this little pathway. Really important to us in Chicago to keep our waterways, the river, the lake, clear for pedestrians, for everyone to enjoy. So that's how we end up with such a specific design. Now the base of that building, only about 39 feet wide, about 13 meters wide, really narrow, and it's pretty tall. So we're gonna deal with sway in the wind. So to bring down the sway in that tower, inside the top of that tower is 160,000 gallons of water, several million liters of water in 12 big tanks. So what happens is when the building begins to sway in one direction, all this water, it just goes, it sloshes in the opposite direction to correct for the sway. It's a big water shock absorber. The inertia creates this balancing liquid force that brings the building back to rest really quickly. So that reduces the sway, which in turn reduces nausea. That is very important, right? You don't want to get seasick at the top of your fancy office tower. So we're always thinking about reducing sway in Chicago. You're going to learn two more ways to do that as we continue through the river. Really quick pause on buildings. Beatnik on the River is this restaurant here to the left. Just a really good spot and a good example of all these restaurants that have popped up along the river in the last few decades, last few years rather, just the last few years. And Beatnik, really great spot, Mediterranean food, love the cocktail menu, the patio is beautiful, recommend it. On our left, once more, is another new glass office building. This is the Bank of America building. Now the Bank of America building is one of our newest, is from just 2020. Now they also had to deal with that pathway rule, 30 feet for the Riverwalk. And they did so using these big tripod legs here that are just kind of vaulting the building by that third floor, which maximizes, as you see, all the office space above it and still allows for a nice Riverwalk pathway. So just a really good example of the constant compromise happening between design and urban planning in Chicago. Developers and architects want one thing for their building. City could have a conflict like a rule here. They have to meet in the middle, and the outcome is often very interesting architecture that really adds to the flavor of the river. So hey, for once, yay, compromise. But let's jump into our little time machine here. The next 5 buildings coming up on the right, they were built in chronological order, and they really demonstrate the evolution of architecture in Chicago. First up on the right, 2 Riverside Plaza, 2 Riverside, another great example of the Art Deco style. So same features, deep dark windows, these machine-like vertical lines, the Indiana limestone tan color, carvings and clocks and the plaza. It's again, think roaring 20s. But then what happened in 1929? The stock market. It crashed, and we entered the Great Depression, and there was a freeze on the building of office buildings from 1930 to 1957, so over 25 years of no building office towers in Chicago. But when we kind of restart architecture in the late 50s, early 60s, we jump into modernism, which you can see over here on the right in Gateway Center 1 and Gateway Center 2, modernism, these black boxes. Now the father of this boring, minimalist style of architecture was a man named Mies van der Rohe, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, really famous guy from Germany. He then came over here to Chicago around World War II, and he said that less is more. That was sort of his catchphrase, less is more. So I think there was sort of an elegant simplicity to these black boxes, darker, starker, cheaper. They're easier to make. These buildings, I would say, are more functionally beautiful instead of really being as eye-catching, aesthetically beautiful, right? Okay, but why'd they build like that? How do they go from that fancy Art Deco style to simple boxes? Well, again, this is the post-Great Depression generation, post-World War II generation, people who were pretty thrifty, who were concerned, hey, there could be another crash someday, maybe we shouldn't spend all this money on gold and statues and carvings. It's a machine for working, that's what an office is, keep the costs low, and that's how they built over 60 of these black boxes in just Chicago alone in a period of only about 15 years. But let us disco on to the groovy 1970s with the international style of Gateway Center 3, this white building on the right. So in the 70s, architects, they're feeling tied down. They're feeling so constrained by the austerity of modernism. Everything's just the same. They want to do something very different, so they go from black boxes to white boxes. Yes, okay, it's not that different. But it has a little more style, you know, some precast concrete, some stone cladding, oh, very fancy. But we call this white box building the international style because you can see a building like that being built really anywhere in the world in the 1970s, perhaps even in your hometowns. I always recommend go back to your hometown, cities near where you live, see if you see any of these trends taking place. Of course, it's possible nothing is the same at all, but it's all interesting information as you start to contextualize where you live. And speaking of context, let's moonwalk to one of my favorite decades for architecture, the 1980s, the Gateway Center 4, this curvy glass building on the right. Now me, I love the 80s. Things went in a whole new direction. Architects, they were tired of boxes. They thought modernism, kind of boring. They wanted something with some personality again. Thus, this contextualist style begins to emerge. You'll notice that the curve in the building mimics again the upcoming curve in the river. Darker green glass matching the color of the river. So again, think about it, this contextualist style, you're trying to build a building that will fit best in this exact location. Back to black boxes. On our left is this simple little black box building here that we did not used to talk about on Architecture Shores, and I think that made the owners maybe a little sad. So they spent over $800,000 to put themselves on the map. That to your left is a giant "You Are Here" map of the Chicago River. So as you look back up at the building after the bridge, you'll see that this little glowing red block, that represents this building here on the river. So we went west down the main branch, turned north up the north branch, turned around, came here, and we have reached that building. Wow. So hey, next time you're lost in downtown Chicago and your phone is falling on the river, just look up at that building. You'll know exactly where to go, not a single street name on it. Very helpful. Well, on our right is another huge Art Deco building, which you might recognize here if we do have any big Batman fans in the house, because this is where Heath Ledger's Joker robbed a Gotham City bank in the 2008 film The Dark Knight. If anyone remembers the movie, the Joker drives this big school bus full of stolen money straight out of that building in the opening scene of the film. Spoiler alert, sorry. But before that, this was the old post office. Yes, so when this building was built, almost 100 years ago, largest post office in the world. Okay, now maybe you're asking yourselves, well, why? Why did Chicago need this big of a post office? Well, before Amazon, before the amazing invention of online shopping, Chicago was the mail order and catalog capital of the world. We had the likes of Sears department store here, among other really big retailers, so we needed such a huge post office to handle this incredibly high volume of mail. But you know, we don't really order out of magazines as much anymore, and that is no longer a post office. It's now a huge office building for huge companies like Uber, Walgreens, PepsiCo, Cisco, just name a few big corporations with space, and that big post office. A building so large that they left room for a highway to eventually get built and go directly through the center of the building. Now as we sail south, down the south branch of the river, first of all, if we follow the south branch in this current direction we're in, we would eventually reach, again, we would eventually reach the Mississippi River, and then you could take the Mississippi all the way down to of the Gulf of Mexico. We will not be doing that today, but hey, it's very possible. At this speed, it would only take 3 weeks. Now we have reached the storytelling portion of this tour. So remember I told you at the beginning, Chicago's story, one of resiliency, strength in the face of problems or challenges. Well, I want you to just keep that in the back of your minds as you listen to these next couple of stories. So here's the first story. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Now in talking about the Great Fire of 1871, there is a lot of myth surrounding the fire, so we need to first separate the facts from the fiction. Now I want to start with the fiction. Okay, so the following is the not true story. Okay, so just so this is clear, this is the untrue story. This is the myth of the fire, the legend I'm sure somebody here has heard. It goes like this. In 1871, they say that a cow in Mrs. O'Leary's barn, so the legend goes, that Mrs. O'Leary, she was milking her cow, as she often did. But then on this particular evening, the cow got really upset. And the cow just sort of kicked over a big kerosene lantern that she was holding, which started the whole barn on fire. And then soon they say, in just a few hours, that the whole city of Chicago was ablaze, all from the kick of a single cow. Now, maybe that story is familiar to some people here, maybe it's ringing a bell. Oh yeah, fire, Chicago, a cow. Now the story of our cow, it's really gotten around over the years because they used to teach it in schools, but it is not true. Now, there's some truth to the story, so it can get kind of confusing. So breaking it down. First of all, Mrs. O'Leary, she was a real person. Her name was Catherine O'Leary. She was an Irish immigrant, and she did have a barn here in Chicago. And we also know that she was the owner of at least 1, maybe 3 cows. And we do believe that this fire actually started in this actual barn, but importantly, critically, there is no proof. There is no evidence whatsoever to blame it on this cow or blame it on poor Mrs. O'Leary or anyone else for that matter. We don't know. We don't know how the fire truly began. Remains a mystery. But hey, the city of Chicago, they officially exonerated Mrs. O'Leary and her cow very swiftly in 1997. So yeah, it only took 125 years, but they did. They cleared her name. Now I will say there was a Mr. O'Leary there. His name was Patrick O'Leary. He was her husband, also present during the fire, never mentioned in the story. Very interesting. Now what are the facts though? The facts that we know. In the mid-1800s, the population in Chicago is exploding. Industrialization, new jobs. So our city is officially founded in 1837. In 1837, 4,000 residents. By 1900, over 1 million people live here. And our building new buildings is trying to keep up with this incredible growth. Well, we were building everything here mostly out of wood. And not even just buildings. The streets, the sidewalks, really everything kind of made of wood. And it had been a very, very dry summer. So, around 9 p.m. on October 8th, 1871, a fire started in this barn, located only about a mile to the right over on the west side of the river. Now the fire, it burns over the course of 30 hours. It destroys over 18,000 buildings, leaves over 100,000 people, about a third of the population without homes, and tragically kills about 300 people. 3.5 square miles of the city are just gone, burned to the ground. The largest urban fire ever at that time. High winds in the Windy City, they create these fire tornadoes, these cyclones of flame that jump across this river twice, lighting it, the river itself, on fire. How? Because the river was so polluted at the time from the meatpacking industry just sort of putting whatever they didn't want into the river, lights on fire. So not good. Disaster, headline news across the world. But remember how I told you that Chicago is resilient? That fire was far and away the worst, and yet also the best thing to ever happen to Chicago, because it meant that the city had to fully rebuild, fully reinvent itself, just kind of start over from scratch. So architects, they came to Chicago from across the country after this fire, and they learned from Chicago's mistakes. They started to build out of steel frames instead of wood. The rebuilding of the city, it started the next day after the fire and didn't look back. Within 15 years, a man named William LeBaron Jenney, he built the first ever steel frame skyscraper, the first kind of modern skyscraper ever. He built it here in Chicago. It was called the Home Insurance Building. It's no longer around, but considered that first steel frame skyscraper. So we were going to turn around again in a moment, give you a really cool view of some very cool buildings downtown, one in particular. And as you look out at the city, I invite everyone here to think about how Chicago would not be laid out in its same formation that it's in today, because we wouldn't have the same simple organized grid system of streets. This grid of streets comes from the rebuild. Chicago wouldn't have the same beautiful 28 miles of lakefronts that it has today, because all the debris and burned out buildings are then used to kind of build the lakefront out into what it is now. Chicago certainly would not have been developed in the ways that it was downtown, thanks to all these architects that attracted after the fire. And that's because the center of the city burned down. Not just the outskirts, not just different neighborhoods, but the center of it all reduced to ash, which attracted all these people to come rebuild it, which led to more buildings being built, and more businesses coming here, and more people coming here, and businesses, and people, and buildings, and so on and so forth. In short, Chicago would not be the same city that it is today. It really would not look the way it does to us right now without this fateful fire. One second. It used to be a coal power plant. That's what that was. Yeah, coal power plant. So Chicago often has a lot of nicknames. One is the second city. The second city. Now this nickname has a lot of origins that have a lot of disputed origins. So the one that I like to say is that it's called the second city because it's just Chicago 2.0, the city that rose like a phoenix from the ashes of this fire. Now, some very cool buildings in front of us. Don't worry, I'm going to talk about them. But first of all, this is about the halfway point of the tour. So again, if you want to go visit Jamie, like I said, we're going to shut down the bar before we get back. So I'd say a great time to visit Jamie before last call. Go for it. And before we get to more of these buildings, I do want to tell you the second story. That's about the 1893 World's Fair. So, just 22 years after this fire, a couple of decades later, Chicago has rebuilt itself. It feels amazing. Wants to show off to the world. New year, new me. And they get to host the 1893 World's Fair. Now, this fair was held in Jackson Park, which is down on the south side of the city. Big, beautiful park to this day. Now, they called the fair the White City, because over 200 buildings were built for the fair, and they were all painted white, so it looked like Venice, the design theme of the fair. Where for 6 months, 27 million people came to visit. 27 million visitors. Now, they came to do things. They came to ride the first ever Ferris wheel, to eat new foods like Cracker Jacks, juicy fruit gum, the brownie, to drink a new beer called Pabst, later known as Pabst Blue Ribbon, because of the first prize they won at this fair, to see important inventions like spray paint and the dishwasher, and even the zipper. Wow, I mean, hey, where would we be without the zipper? But I think the real important part about the fair is that all these millions of people, they left. They went home, of course, across the country, across the world after the fair, talking about beautiful architecture of Jackson Park, cool inventions like the zipper, and about this now rebuilt city called Chicago here in the middle of the U.S. So that fair, putting the city on the map for the first time as this world-class city that people really started to know about, talk about across the globe. Speaking of world class, this building on your right, it might look familiar to you, might remind you a little bit of Marina City, the Corncob Towers. That's because this is its sister building. This is called River City. River City is another circular building made of concrete where you can have everything you need to live right above the Chicago River. There's office and retail space. There's this big child care facility right on the first floor there. Awesome marina for your personal boat underneath the building. So nice in the summertime. Take your boat out through the river, spend your day on Lake Michigan, come back through the river at night, go right up to your apartment. Beautiful, easy. So many people in Chicago own boats. Somehow, I have never met a single one, but hey, one day. Now, that building also designed by Bertrand Goldberg in the 1980s. And Bertrand Goldberg, he really, like I said, one of his goals, not just to build cool buildings, but he wanted to attract people to live downtown. And nowadays, while downtown certainly is not some big, affordable place, it is very residential. I think that's in large part due to that very visionary architect. But we have now reached in front of us the Chicago royal family. We have the Queen, the Sears or the Willis Tower, that very tall black box building with those glowing antennas. I know I just said two different names, and we're going to discuss that. And then we have the Princess, 311 South Wacker, this pink granite building, octagonal shaped, big glowing barrel at the top there, looking like the crown on the building. And then we'll have the lady, the Chicago Board of Trade building over there on the right, with the statue on top. Starting with that statue building over there, that is the Chicago Board of Trade building. It will be more of the Art Deco style. So same features that we keep seeing. These deep dark windows, that tan Indiana limestone color. As we get closer, you'll see again this sheer vertical structure, these lines just sort of racing right up to the top, right to the statue. Now the statue up there is of Ceres, the Roman goddess of grain, agriculture. Ceres is on top of there because they used to trade grain commodities on the floor of the building back in the 1930s. Now if you go inside that building, I'd really recommend it. Beautiful Art Deco lobby. These golden husks of corn, soaring shafts of wheat. It's sort of like if Great Gatsby met farming. Very cool. And then we have the Princess 311 South Wacker, this pink building ahead, that big glowing barrel. Now the barrel up there, this is like this every night. It glows at night, every evening. Very cool part of the skyline. But they ran into a problem back in the 90s. Okay, kind of a weird story, where they used to light up that building so incredibly bright. Back in the 90s, it was confusing the migration patterns of birds. The lights used to be so incredibly bright up there, birds thought the tower was the moon, and they would fly into the building, fly around the building, get tired. It's terrible. Awful. Hey, we in Chicago, we love birds, and we always learn from our mistakes. So nowadays, we actually dim the lights on that building and every single building in Chicago to allow birds safe travels during their migration seasons. So Midwestern nice of us. Yeah, did you have a question over here? Question? Did you have a question? Okay. So, enough about birds. We have now reached the one, the only, the tallest tower in Chicago. Straight ahead, the Sears or Willis Tower. So, let us rewind to 1973. In 1973, Sears Department Store builds the tallest tower in the world at the time. Here in the Windy City, you're going to deal again with sway. So to bring down the sway in that building, they just built 9 of them. They built 9 towers in one single tower. Now the concept is called bundled tubes. Bundled tubes, each tower is a perfect square, and you just bundle them together, make them hug each other, shorter to taller. If this sounds confusing, I will show you exactly how it works right after this bridge. It's sort of like it's spiraling upward to these 2 tallest towers, and that relatively simple design braces the building against the wind. But that design concept, bundled tubes, created by someone named Fazlur Khan, amazing structural engineer. He was born in what is today Bangladesh. And that made that the tallest tower in the world for about 25 years. At 1,451 feet, 442 meters, 110 floors. Tallest tower in the world, about 25 years. Now currently the tallest tower in the world is called the Burj Khalifa. The Burj Khalifa is in Dubai. Now the Burj Khalifa in Dubai stands at over 2,700 feet tall. It is over 800 meters tall. It is nearly 2 Sears towers just stacked on top of each other. It's very tall. But if you've never seen it before, if you've never seen it, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, it looks a lot like the Trump Tower in Chicago. It's got the same kind of spiral design. It's just double the size. It was designed by the same architect, Adrian Smith, who is from Chicago. Hey, full circle. So that's why in Chicago, you know, we can say that while we no longer have the world's tallest tower, we used to have the world's tallest architect. So cool. And you know, he's actually 5'7". Now, the Sears Tower, the Willis Tower, hey, 2 different names, that's confusing. So to clear up any confusion here, Sears did leave. Sears left the building in the 90s, and then Willis's insurance brokerage firm, they started renting the naming rights in 2009, so that's why for the last 15 years, it has been technically called the Willis Tower. Well listen, Chicagoans, they're very stubborn. They're very nostalgic. You ask a true lifelong Chicagoan, what is the name of your tallest tower? They are probably going to yell at you that that is the Sears Tower, and I hate this other name. But again, in case it is confusing, Sears Tower, Willis Tower, same building. You want to sound like a local though? Sears Tower. Now you can go up to the top, by the way, go up to the sky deck, the 103rd floor, see amazing views of the whole city up there at the sky deck, and also learn a lot too, great educational information up there. But you know, my favorite fun fact that I always think about when I'm up in the sky deck about the building is that the Sears Tower has been successfully climbed 2 times. Now the first person who climbed it was an American. His name was Dan Goodwin. Dan Goodwin climbed it wearing a full Spider-Man costume, and he used little suction cups. And the second was a guy from France. His name was Alain Robert, who climbed the building using nothing. He used no equipment. He was called free soloed the face of the Sears Tower with his bare hands. He used just the window ledges, and he did this in a little over 1 hour. I know, he really did. He did, 1999. So for that, we call him the French Spider-Man, and we also call him Nuts. Now, both men made successfully to the top of the tower, and they did make it back down successfully. Do not worry, both men, they were unfortunately successfully arrested when they got up there. So yeah, I don't really recommend climbing the tower. Historically speaking, not really worked out well for anyone. So any kids out there listen to me, hey, you guys, don't climb towers. Don't do it. Moral of the story. Now I want to talk about a Chicago nickname here that I've already said a bunch of times. I'm sure you've heard it before. The Windy City. The Windy City, okay. Now Chicago for sure, lots of winds. Big buildings, big lake, long winter. However, Chicago was originally called the Windy City, and there's some debate about this, but originally called the Windy City in the sense of Chicagoans being, people living here being long-winded, or kind of boastful. So back in the 1800s, Chicagoans were known to brag about Chicago, kind of talk a lot about how great the city was, and we had politicians too that were known to be very, very smooth talking and slick. These politicians, they'd sort of say anything to get things done. All these factors led to people in other places calling Chicago windy, and the citizens here windbags. Yeah, and you know, it's 2024, and hey, not that much has changed. Chicagoans, we still love to brag about our city. We love to tell you how great it is. I've been doing this now for like 45 minutes. So we are pretty windy in that sense too. Now if I may get windy about this building on our right, this is the glorious Civic Opera Building. The Civic Opera Building here is the second largest opera house in all of North America. Over 3,600 seats. It's a huge Art Deco building again, with all of this Roman detail carved into the front of it, including even how they spell building. People often ask me why there's a V there instead of a U, because in Latin U's were written like V's, so they're really trying to make it look like this authentically Roman opera house. This is still an opera house. This is the home to the Lyric Opera of Chicago, as well as the Joffrey Ballet. 2 of the over 200 performing arts companies that call Chicago home. Chicago is a huge, huge theater city, big hub for the arts in general. Always recommend to see a play, live music, comedy, amazing art in Chicago. Definitely take advantage of it while you are here. Now I talked about some nicknames. We had the second city after the first one burned down. We have the Windy City after all the talking. But the actual name of Chicago, where does that name Chicago come from? So the name Chicago comes from several local native indigenous tribes to this area, which gives me a great opportunity to recognize, acknowledge, and lift up the original inhabitants of this land, the original stewards of this land, before European colonization. Now they include, among others, there are the Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Peoria, Kaskaskia, Miami, Ojibwe, Odawa, Ho-Chunk, among even more First Nations that lived and traveled through the area now for thousands of years, and that are still here. Chicago is one of the largest urban indigenous populations. Over 75,000 Native people live in this area. And I said travel around. So back 300 years ago, Native tribes moved around the area of the Great Lakes a lot, not really staying in one spot all year round, mainly due to changes in the weather, in the seasons. And so lots of different tribes came through the area with different languages and different names for the land. So there was Chicago, Chicago, Chicagoa, names that kind of all roughly translate to smelly onion. Yes, because there was this garlicky, wild-smelling onion that used to grow in this area back when this is more of a swamp, really, than a river. All these onions jumping up out of the ground, and they were known to have a very strong smell. So that's why you are currently in the Stinky Onion. Welcome, welcome. But as we cross underneath another one of these bridges, we have 37 of these bridges in Chicago. 37 moving bridges. That is second most of any city in the world, second only to the city of Amsterdam in terms of this style of bridge. And every bridge that we crossed underneath today, every bridge in Chicago is a functioning bridge. We can raise all of them, and we raise them most frequently in the spring and the fall for sailboats to get through the river. On a schedule, they'll lift them for the sailboats to get through the river so they can spend their summer on beautiful Lake Michigan. Straight ahead of us, this giant glass tower soaring into the sky. This is Salesforce Tower. Now, Salesforce Tower here has the distinction of being the newest building on our river. It is from less than a year ago, 2023 it was opened. Now, a great example of how much Chicago is changing, how much the river is always evolving. If anyone here has taken this tour before, maybe you took this tour way back in 2019, 5 years ago. We have talked about a lot of new things here today. You take the tour again, another couple of years, even more new things to discuss. A lot of big plans in Chicago right now. They're building a lot more housing along the south branch of the river because that's, again, very desirable. They're building a couple more tall office towers. They're even building a Bally's Casino on the north branch of the river, not far away. Maybe. The casino thing has been very controversial. Not sure if that one's going to actually go through. But all the same, if you come back in a few years, objectively, you will see a new Chicago. But some things never change, like the Merchandise Mart. So again, this is where we saw the art show earlier. The Merchandise Mart here, this is, I think, the classic example of the Art Deco style. Again, that same features that we keep seeing. The deep windows, the tan and yellow limestone color. And this building, when it was built, almost 100 years ago now, this was the largest commercial office building by area in the world, 4.2 million square feet, 73 football fields of office space, over 7 miles of just hallways. Also, 8 beautiful heads in front of it. 8 big heads in front of the building, these statues here. So the heads, they're basically big businessmen of Chicago in the mid-20th century. Marshall Field, Montgomery Ward, Woolworth, Wanamaker, Benjamin Sears Department Store. Basically guys who made millions of dollars in Chicago and then got turned into those Pez dispensers overlooking one of the largest commercial office buildings in the country. Quite the way to be remembered. Sorry? Sorry, it's a joke. They look like Pez dispensers, which is basically a candy dispensing machine. Yeah. Sorry, pretty niche there. As we sail east towards this lakefront, I want to talk to you a little more about the river and confess to you that Chicago's river has not always been very clean. This is true, right? Since the founding of this city, they have dealt with pollution here. However, Chicago has really done a lot in the last few decades to clean the river up, to get us better water quality, better ecosystem. Just to give you one example of how we have improved our river, back in the 1970s, there were fewer than 10 species of fish left in this river. Nowadays, hold that thought. Well, nowadays, there are nearly 80 species of fish. People fish in the river again, they kayak in here, and in fact, all types of animals are returning. I even read an article 2 days ago that there are otters in the river again. Yes, river otters in the river. I know, so exciting. They're adorable. I've not seen one yet, to be clear, but it's only a matter of time. Now, in terms of clean design, on our left is the gorgeous red brick Reed Murdoch Center. Now, the Reed Murdoch Center here, first of all, this definitely has some of my favorite lighting in the city here. This is the closest thing on the river to a style, prairie style. So prairie style meant to imitate the horizon-hugging plains and prairies of the Midwest. So these long, flat lines, the wide windows, red earthy color. You can look at that building, imagine the long horizon, just kind of relaxed. Very calming style to look at. Architecture, it can definitely affect your mood. You know, the way a building is shaped, stylized, colored, that can affect how we're feeling. So, to prove this theory, coming up here on our right after this bridge, on the right you're going to see a not so relaxing style to look at. This short, stocky, kind of angry looking building right here on the right. in the middle, 55 West Wacker. 55 here is a style called brutalism. Brutalism, nothing but raw, rough concrete. It is like modernism turned up to 100, just this big exposed exoskeleton of a building. Now that is not the prettiest building in the river, I know, but it's a very important style here from the 60s. We're all from across the world here, right? We've all probably seen a building like this where we live, in banks, courthouses, government buildings, universities, because brutalism is pretty easy to build. You want that functional building, it's pretty cheap. Brutalism, great way to go. But hey, luckily for all of us on an architecture tour in Chicago, plenty of beautiful buildings to discuss. Jumping back into those. So on the right here, you can see this tan building with all the domes. That big dome is up there at the top. That is the Jewelers building with that big dome from 1926, made to look a bit like this Italian monastery. Now they call it the Jewelers building because jewelers worked in that building in the 1920s and 30s. And back then, these jewelers, they had a car elevator in the building, so they could drive their cars of really expensive jewelry into the building. The elevator took them up, and that way they were not robbed in Prohibition-era Chicago. During the Prohibition period, when they banned alcohol in the United States, a lot of people run around like Al Capone, etc. Not the greatest place to be is fancy jewelry, so a smart security feature. Now, if you like jewelry, you probably like diamonds and gold. This is a great segue by me. So coming up here on our right, you're gonna see this building with the diamond shape, all that color up there. That is 2 Prudential Plaza. First of all, this is very unique lighting. I've actually never seen the lighting like this until tonight, so very cool, very new. And that is 2 Prudential Plaza. It's meant to look a little bit like the Chrysler Building in New York City. If you're familiar with the Chrysler Building in New York City, sort of that's a classic Art Deco building, and this is sort of like a modernized version of an Art Deco building. All that glass up there. And then before that, that building that looks like it has a cork up there, that is the carbide and carbon building, that building that looks like it has the cork, and it has real gold, that's all gold up there at the top of the building. And it's meant to look a bit like a champagne bottle because it was built in 1929. So it was thought of as this sort of like, hey, it's Prohibition, so we're gonna build this champagne bottle building. Ha 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 ha. And you know what? Prohibition ended a couple years later, so I guess they really worked. Now, hey, if that got you in the mood for some champagne, you should grab a glass at London House. London House is a hotel with a really cool rooftop bar. Definitely recommend the London House rooftop bar. Great drinks, but it's really all about the views. There are a lot of rooftop bars in Chicago. I like this one particularly. Amazing view here of the river. Check it out. But in front of us, once more, we have the Wrigley Building. That's Spanish Cathedral, the clock tower up there. And then behind that Spanish Cathedral, you're going to see this little French cathedral in the Chicago Tribune Tower. So the Tribune Tower back there, that Tribune Tower is a style called French Gothic Revival because it was modeled after a 13th century cathedral in Rouen, Normandy, France. Now this Gothic skyscraper, its big flying buttresses up there at the top, those are the arches up there, forming the crown of the building, was home to the Chicago Tribune newspaper for about 100 years. But the Tribune, it left that tower a few years ago, and now they are turning it into luxury condos, one of which has now sold for $8 million. I know, another great deal. And then behind that, you've got this dome, that sort of purple-blue dome up there. That is the Intercontinental, beautiful Art Deco hotel. And that dome, meant to look a bit like a minaret, the top of a mosque. This was home to the Shriners when it was built. It has no purpose today, but the dome had one original function, to be a dock for blimps, for big Zeppelin balloons. Passenger blimps. Passenger blimps, very popular in the 1930s until one crashed, the Hindenburg, and then they got pretty unpopular after that. So no blimps ever did land there that we know of. But if you own a blimp and you're trying to park it, you should call. You should call it in. Oh no, they're touching the bridge. It's not bad. They shouldn't do it. The captain told us all. Don't touch the bridge. On our left, this building with that very iconic peacock logo. That is, of course, NBC Tower. This is home to NBC Studios here in Chicago. Now you're looking at the NBC Tower, and you're all experts now. Deep dark windows, soaring vertical lines, Indiana limestone color, big spire. You're thinking, Ricky, this is Art Deco. However, this building was only built in 1989. It is a style called Eco Deco. It is a copycat style of the Roaring 20s Art Deco period. We've seen this a lot today, architects borrowing from each other. 100 years ago, copying European cathedrals. 30 years ago, copying Art Deco. In 50 years, maybe copying the glass boxes being built today. It's just such a cycle architecture, always reusing, reinventing with modern technology. Speaking of styles we learned about, on our right we got the James Hardy right there, black box, classic black box right there. And then behind that black box is the Swiss Hotel. The Swiss Hotel is a triangular hotel. Now, where did we learn about triangles? Oh yeah, Harry Weiss, remember he was the architect who built the river cottages, also built the Swiss Hotel, loved to sail, remember? No guys, look at Aqua Tower. Okay, so the Aqua Tower over here on the right is this white building in the background, those horizontal wavy fins. I love Aqua Tower there. Each unit has its own geometrically unique balcony, no balcony exactly the same. So it looks a bit like this cascading wave of water. Aqua Tower. What's up? Now, that building, Aqua Tower, designed by Jeannie Gang, an amazing woman, an amazing architect who also designed this building on our right. The very tall, very curvy, and very new St. Regis to the right. Now this breathtaking St. Regis Tower, this is now the third tallest tower in all of Chicago at nearly 1,200 feet, almost 400 meters, finished in just 2020. But this is now actually the tallest tower in the world, designed by a woman, Jeannie Gang, who again, yeah, is from Illinois. She's from this area, she's a local Chicago architect, and I think she's just doing amazing things for Chicago. Hopefully she will continue to do so. She's actually going to be pretty soon building a new terminal at the O'Hare Airport, an $8 billion renovation. Now that building, it cost over $1 billion to build it. So, you know, it's pretty luxurious, let's say. It has about 200 hotel rooms. The hotel opened last year. The rooms start at $700 a night. It has about 400 condominiums. The condos range in price from $1 million for a one-bedroom apartment to a $20.5 million condo that has 4 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, 2 floors. At the top of that middle tower, its own private rooftop pool. Its own private rooftop pool. That's where I live. But hey, just so you know, there are to this day some unsold condos in this building. So if you're in the market, if anyone's in the market, you know, for a cozy spot in Chicago, I mean, great option right here. It's beautiful, curvy St. Regis. I just had to point out these amazing real estate opportunities, right? These incredible deals for you today. Now, speaking of prime real estate, coming up on our left, you're going to see in the distance a tall black tower. It's coming into view now. Tall black tower. It has kind of a curvy shape. And then this sort of disc up there at the top. Beyond that crane. That is Lake Point Tower. Lake Point Tower, again, that far building on the left. That's sort of almost fading away into the night sky. Now that building is very unique because that is the only tower currently built directly on the lakefront in Chicago. Now that is due to zoning laws in Chicago that prohibit development of towers right on our lake. Going back to the idea I mentioned before, we want to keep our waterways, the river, but especially the lake, clear for pedestrians and cyclists and parks and beaches. Kind of everyone owns their lake, no towers. But in the late 1960s, developers found loopholes in the zoning laws that have since been closed, which is why they'll probably be the only tower ever built in that close proximity east of that highway right next to the lake. But as you can imagine, pretty popular place to live over the years. Some past famous residents of Lake Point Tower have included Halle Berry, Alice Cooper, Goldie Hawn, Kurt Russell, Sammy Sosa, Scottie Pippen, even Tom Cruise. All had a residence in beautiful and scenic Lake Point Tower. And if you were to go up to the top of Lake Point Tower, first of all, there used to be a restaurant at the top. There used to be a restaurant in this disc up there. It closed last year. Super big bummer. But hopefully they'll put a new restaurant up there very soon. Especially because I never went to the last one, and I really want to get up there. And that would probably have the best view, honestly, best view in the city, if there was to be a restaurant up there again. Oh, beautiful. Lake Michigan. Beautiful Lake Michigan, which is now just a couple hundred meters away from us. We have 28 miles of lakefront in Chicago, over 20 beaches for swimming, 10 harbors for boats. Lake Michigan is such a big part of the culture of Chicago. When the weather is nice, I mean, a day like today, summertime, Saturday, everyone's trying to go to the lake. And I really would recommend that you do that. That on your trip to Chicago, you visit Lake Michigan. There's so many ways to take advantage of the lake. You can go to one of, again, we have over 20 beaches. The beaches are great for sitting out there, tanning, reading, playing volleyball. You can go swimming in the lake. Swimming in the lake is really refreshing. It's pretty cold, I'm not gonna lie, pretty cold lake. But it really is nice. On a hot, hot day like it was today, jumping in that lake sounds amazing. You can go to the Lakefront Trail. The Lakefront Trail is a pathway that goes 18 miles along this lakefront. It's great for a walk, jog, bike ride. I really recommend taking advantage of our beautiful, humongous lakefront. It is truly the natural wonder of Chicago. On our left, though, Navy Pier out there with that lovely Ferris wheel. That Ferris wheel is another great spot when it's open for a great view of Chicago. But speaking of great views of Chicago, we are turning around and giving you exactly that. So I'm going to jump off the mic here, let you enjoy these beautiful views, take some photos. I recommend it. Important announcement, last call for the restroom. Last call for the restroom. Need to use the restroom, do so now. Sell your tab at the bar. Otherwise, enjoy this beautiful view. I'll see you in a couple minutes. And
what are these angles? Spam it.
And just a reminder, please do not stand or kneel on any benches or chairs, even while taking photos. Thank you, thank you. The Chicago River. So nowadays, Lake Michigan out there flows west into the river. Today, lake flows into a river. But this was not always true. In the late 1800s, the river used to flow naturally east into the lake. Now the problem with that was we were treating the river back then as a sewer. So we were dumping all this waste into the river, which is then being carried out into that lake. And that was poisoning what is still today our drinking supply of water. This led to all types of public health problems, and it was gross. So what do we do about this? So we called in the Army Corps of Engineers. Now for 8 years, at the end of the 1800s, they dug a 28-mile canal, a long canal west, that crossed through 100 feet of rock. And essentially, they dug so deep into the ground that they used the force, the pull of gravity to permanently tilt and reverse the direction of the river, so that nowadays clean, mean green Lake Michigan water flows west to the Chicago River, flushing onto the Mississippi, eventually to the Gulf of Mexico. But of course, a very important part of that, as I said, we have done a lot to clean up our river. Chicago is no longer pumping its sewage directly into its river. Hooray. So as to not just send a bunch of bad water down the river, which is really, really important. We want to be good neighbors to all of our friends who live down the Mississippi River. Now we're going to pull into our dock pretty soon. So I'm going to ask everyone to, if you're not seated, start to find a seat. Everyone can begin finding a seat as we pull into the dock and just remain seated as we get into our dock for your safety. Again, we appreciate everybody finding a seat wherever you may be. Well, before we get into our dock, I want to talk to you about one more thing, and that's about a person, about a human being. A person named Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. I'm so sorry if you speak French. I'm working on it. But in Chicago, his name is always pronounced Du Sable by locals. Locals say Du Sable. So who was Du Sable? Du Sable was the first non-native settler of Chicago. He is known as being the first Chicagoan, the founder of Chicago. Now, Du Sable was biracial. He was of African and French descent. He was born in what is today the nation of Haiti in the Caribbean. And Du Sable established a trading post in this area in the 1780s. So that's about 50 years before Chicago ever a city. Du Sable comes here, establishes this outpost, becomes a really big supply station for all these fur traders in the area, becomes a really big business. And Du Sable, our first Chicagoan from Haiti, becomes a successful and wealthy man. He's got a barn, he's got a stable, 5-bedroom lodge. Now, we don't know a lot more about him, but we do know that he married Kitihawa. Kitihawa was a local Potawatomi woman who was his translator and business partner. And we know that he and Kitihawa and his family, they eventually left the area, moved south to what is now Missouri. But I always think about him at this point in the tour. I choose to talk about Du Sable at the very end of the tour, because as we look out at these tall buildings, this booming metropolis, this home to millions and millions of people, it always kind of gets me thinking about Du Sable and how I think it would have been probably beyond his wildest dreams, right? That his settlement one day will become everything we have seen today, and truly so much more. But I think it just goes to show you never know. One person can begin, one immigrant can start with a lot of courage, a lot of vision. And so Du Sable, he's a very important part of our city's history. That's why his name is on many things: a harbor, a highway, a bridge, a school, and a museum. The Du Sable Museum of Black History. It's on the south side of Chicago. It's near the University of Chicago. It's a really fascinating and beautiful museum. I can't recommend it highly enough. The Du Sable Museum in gorgeous, historic Hyde Park. But as I said, our journey is coming to a close, so please remain seated and take a seat.